So we made it to 2024. Now I'm pretty sure we're going to need to prepare ourselves for a wild ride. And what do I mean by that? Well, let me put it this way. You know what's going to be real crazy to see? When or if Trump wins in 2024, the establishment's going to throw everything and anything at him. We will see lawfare unlike anything we've seen so far. They will contest the results in any way possible. Delegates will be challenged, the whole nine. Every single thing they've complained about since 2020 will be surpassed tenfold with malicious intent. They will go scorched earth before allowing a peaceful transition of power. And all of these people will make excuses about saving democracy while they do it. It's going to be so very absurd. The hypocrisy of it all will collapse faith in the system by itself. So prepare yourselves, because as I said, 2024 is going to be unlike anything we've seen in our lives. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Plato once said a nation can survive its fools, and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within. And that's exactly what we're dealing with. If you take a look at everything happening around you and try to pick a side, either incompetence or malicious intent, you'd be hard-pressed to accept the adage that they're all simply very, very stupid. So yeah, despite what the media propaganda claims, the current policy positions on virtually every issue weakens the country and introduces threats. They seem to be setting up conditions that would allow catastrophic situations to unfold, which could then be used to consolidate power, and through chaos, the public will be more agreeable to severe authoritarian positions. You just can't convince me that these politicians don't understand the implications of their actions.
A change can be shaped by us.
And on top of that, I would bet that they know damn well that most of the idiots running around today would choose security over freedom, simply because they don't understand the consequences. No foresight. Or, I should say, they have no reference point. Most people have no idea how bad things can really get. Anyway, I think there's something bigger happening. And to me, there's two easy examples showcasing malice. It's the border and the deliberate subversion of elections. So let's start with the first one. The open border policy is pretty interesting because the public statements are in clear opposition to reality. They come out and say that there is no border crisis and that border security is one of their top priorities. At the same time, they are threatening to sue Texas for trying to enforce their border. They are facilitating travel, giving cash in envelopes and sending them on planes. And on top of that, they just recently went down to Mexico as reported to quote-unquote solve the crisis. You know, the crisis they say doesn't even exist. But here's the real sticking point. Their big plan to solve the issue involves simply facilitating migration flow and, I quote, opening up new ports of entry. Yep, that is their plan. This is not something that could be explained as incompetence. Something really crazy is happening, and there's a couple ways to look at it. It's multifaceted. So, let's just say, hypothetically, that the federal government is not turning directly inward to target you. Well, if that is the case, then there's an old concept that could explain what's happening, and I quote, when the tyrant has disposed of foreign enemies by conquest or treaty, and there is nothing to fear, well, then he is always stirring up some other wary foe so that people remember why they need a leader, end of quote. We've seen these policies play out in real time across the world. They left weapons in Afghanistan that were quickly seized by the Taliban. Now, we have some very well-armed terrorists out there, and eventually they will do something. At that point, the United States will come out claiming that we must fight against these evildoers.
Now watch this drive.
And boom, you're right back in active conflict rather than proxy wars. I mean, even Hamas was seen with M4s, so our weapons are making their way to many different terror groups. And I don't even want to think about all the weapons that did not arrive in Ukraine as expected. We are essentially arming terror groups around the world, setting up conflict. They've taken the Houthis off the terror list, and then those exact Houthis have attacked US bases over 100 times since, and are currently targeting ships in the Red Sea. Which, honestly, is interesting in of itself because it ties into the economic war between China, Russia, Iran, and the West. Now it does seem to me that a lot of the conflict revolves around these gas pipelines heading into Europe, and countering commercial shipping lanes because China has a plan for an alternative route. That would hurt the US economically in severe ways. But let's talk about that initial quote, stirring up a wary foe. However, let's talk about it in the context of consolidating power domestically. Now, hundreds of terrorists have been apprehended at the border. Just imagine the number that did not get caught. They have created a situation that would be cataclysmic. But as I said, it's multifaceted. The immigration crisis can sow chaos in multiple ways. It's not only about security, it's also about direct social and economic effects that are both tied together. On the social end, it creates resentment within our communities, as you see happening in Chicago and New York City. That social discord is exacerbated by economic toil. As more funds, billions and billions of dollars are pumped out of city budgets, cuts to education, emergency services, healthcare services, etc., and are reorganized to be pumped back into immigration services, well, that creates resentment among local resident groups, their actual constituents. Why are we being overlooked? That kind of thing. However, that is not all. With economic strife comes crime. A rise in crime offers them an opportunity for draconian surveillance and police measures. Just to keep you safe, obviously. It's a tried and true tactic. And so, if the social and economic impact does not put us on the verge of collapse, sleeper cells being activated and a renewal of terror attacks on U.S. soil will. Now, I don't know what it's going to take, but people have to realize that migration is being used as a weapon, and this is global in scale. The point, I believe, is to destabilize Western civilization. From the boats coming ashore in Italy, to the infusion of migrants in France and the UK, all the way to the U.S. southern border. It's all connected.
The numbers are extraordinarily large. This is something that is not specific to the United States' southern border. This is something that we are seeing throughout the hemisphere and throughout the world.
Yeah, it's all about destabilizing the West, and there is a lot of different aspects that they could take advantage of. However, it's all about setting the stage and then adapting to whichever event comes first. The real crazy part is that right after this moment comes, the media will come out claiming that no one could have predicted it, which is complete BS. I'm pretty sure everybody can see that we are set up for something. The only thing to really determine is what said event will really be. However, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's talk about the current debate on election procedures. So, the election interference by Democrats to keep Trump off the ballot. They know that this is a fundamentally dangerous quote-unquote tactic because it destabilizes the very foundation of the United States, which really, if you think about it, might be the point in of itself. We are in a moment that we have to decide. Are we a government made of the people by the people or not? Do we actually choose who represents us or not? And once that foundational aspect is put into question, the entire house of cards begins to crumble. And again, that is not by accident. I think in general, people have realized that they don't have real representation in government. So again, no matter how you look at it, we're kind of at a tipping point. That's right, it's a big club and you ain't in it. They want zero outsiders winning political office and screwing up their plans for global technocratic rule. I know, I'm always harping on the global aspect, but all the UN pacts that the US has signed onto cannot exist nor function with the US standing firm to our principles. The United States and our individual liberties are in the way of this grand plan. Their entire plan is rendered moot by our founding documents, and in their eyes, it all needs to change. So, at some point, you might have to consider that destruction was always the goal. You just can't convince me that these politicians don't understand the implications of their actions. It's all about moving to a carbon-based system and a new political paradigm that is diametrically opposed to God-given rights. Which, oddly enough, I think is exactly why they target Judeo-Christian concepts so often. They need to dissuade people from the notion that rights are granted by God and are inherent in our creation, and instead to fully believe that rights are granted by the state. If our rights are granted by the state, then the state can take those rights away. I mean, I could go on, but we are dealing with treasonous actions across the board. As stated, a nation can survive its fools and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within. An enemy at the gates is less formidable, for he is known and carries his banner openly. But the traitor moves amongst those within the gate freely, his sly whispers rustling through the alleys, heard in the very halls of government itself. For the traitor appears not as a traitor. He speaks in accents that are familiar to his victims, and he wears their face in their arguments. He appeals to the baseness that lies deep in the hearts of all men. He rots the soul of a nation. He works secretly and unknown in the night to undermine the pillars of the city. He infects the body politic so that it can no longer resist. End of quote. And yeah, that is where we are. So you have heard it said that I believe this system has depravity as its motive, plunder as its goal, lies, fraud, and force as its method, and destruction as the only result. As to build back better, you have to reduce the world to ashes first. And so you might have noticed that a lot of people are beginning to talk about Black Swan events.
Well, mine's a little dark. I just feel a lot of concern that 2024 may be the year of a Black Swan event. This is a national security event with high impact that's very hard to predict. There are a number of concerns that I have that factor into that. Not only this sort of enduring heightened threat level that we're facing, the wars in Israel, also Ukraine, And we're so divided in this country in ways that we haven't seen before. And I think that just creates fertile ground for our adversaries like North Korea, China, and Iran. And that's what concerns me most.
By definition, a black swan event is a high-impact event that is difficult to predict, but in retrospect appears to have been inevitable. Now, the thing is, everybody can sense something coming. And yeah, so my point, if a black swan event is something that you cannot predict, but everybody and their brother is sensing something coming, then is it really a black swan event? None of this was inevitable. It's being deliberately created. Even Klaus Schwab has warned about this.
And the last factor I want to mention is resilience, the capability to bounce back, because there will be certainly what we call the black swans, the unpleasant surprises which will come in our way.
So, what could they be? Most people point to a few possibilities: economic collapse, world war, terror attacks, but I want to talk about one possibility that I feel is the most probable. Now, the reason I believe this to be the case is because this one event could tie into everything else. Yes, that's right, it would have an impact on everything. So, could this black swan event be a catastrophic cyber attack? So, over the holiday break, there was a lot of talk about the Obama-produced movie Leave the World Behind, which is about a cyber attack on the US. And there is a lot of people pointing to the symbolism in the movie, and the fact that it was produced by the Obamas as proof of predictive programming, which I tend to agree. Anyway, I'm not going to give you a movie review. Why don't we just get right into the real-world scenarios? Okay, so Klaus Schwab has been talking about this potential cyber attack ever since the first COVID outbreak.
Pay insufficient attention to the frightening scenario of a comprehensive cyber attack, which would bring to a complete halt to the power supply, transportation, hospital services, our society as a whole. The COVID-19 crisis would be seen in this respect as a small disturbance in comparison to a major cyber attack.
If the power grid is targeted, then it completely destroys the economy. Banks completely shut down, wealth reduced to zero across the board. Now, I don't know, they probably have backup systems, but the whole point is to move you to a new economic system. So, I don't think your personal wealth is going to migrate over. I mean, their slogan is, you'll own nothing and be happy, right? Anyway, if that does happen, chaos will reign, as people in cities begin to eat each other within days, figuratively speaking, with a small chance of that being literal. For example, emergency services, health services, agriculture, food systems, shipping, literally everything is done at that point. And hate to break it to you, but there are very, very few people who are independent on a scale like this. Just the number of people that cannot get prescription medication due to this would cause an untold number of deaths, let alone everything else. On top of that, a cyber attack would be a declaration of war, no doubt. They have been stoking war with Iran for a long time. If they say they hit us, then public sentiment for revenge would be at a fever pitch. And that's the same thing for Russia and China too. They would get an unbelievable amount of support for world war if this happens. Imagine the American public when our lifestyles are destroyed. No easy access to food or heating. People will want blood. It is a perfect false flag. So you might not know about this, but in December, we were actually hit by a cyber attack from China. They targeted a water company in Hawaii, a major West Coast port, and at least one oil and gas pipeline. They also tried to hack into the Texas power grid. Yeah, so there you go. The official statement is as follows, and I quote, "These cyber intrusions are part of a broader plan to find ways to create panic, chaos, and disrupt logistics in case of a conflict between the US and China in the Pacific." End of quote. Do you happen to remember the SolarWinds hack from last year, I believe? This one is still looming on my mind, as the consequences of it are still not felt. They hacked into the Department of Defense, our nuclear weapons systems, and yeah, that's not all. They hacked a bunch of highly critical systems related to national defense. However, it does get even more devious. The World Economic Forum, as you know, collaborated with Russia for Cyber Polygon, a cyber pandemic exercise where they would simulate a massive cyber attack, which is very similar to how they simulated the pandemic with Event 201. It's also very interesting that amongst the Russian collusion hoax, the reports of Russian cyber attacks that the World Economic Forum would collaborate with them, of all nations, to simulate a cyber attack. Just, yeah, I don't know. That's pretty odd, don't you think?
Well, tonight, the nation's intelligence agencies are warning of cyber threats from Russia and are urging U.S. critical infrastructure defenses to be reinforced. As CBS's Bill Whitaker reported on Sunday night's 60 Minutes, it wouldn't take much to throw the entire country into darkness.
The grid is a sprawling target. There are actually 3 in the U.S., the Eastern, Western, and Texas has its own. Most of us rarely notice substations. There are 55,000 across the country, each housing transformers, the workhorses of the grid. Inside these massive metal boxes, raw electricity is converted to higher or lower voltages. Should a transformer explode, like this one in Manhattan during Superstorm Sandy, the system is designed to trigger a localized grid-preserving blackout. But if several sections of the grid go down at the same time, the shutdowns can cascade like dominoes. That's what set off the Great Northeast Blackout in 2003, leaving 45 million Americans without power. A few months before the assault on Metcalf, John Wellinghoff of FERC commissioned a study to see if a physical attack on critical transformers could trigger cascading blackouts.
It was actually a very shocking result to us that there's a very few number of substations you need to take out in the entire United States to knock out the entire grid.
Knock out the entire grid?
That's correct.
How many would it take to knock out, putting the entire country in a blackout?
Less than 20.
And Bill Whitaker joins us now. So, Bill, just 20 substations to knock out the entire system? I mean, that's unbelievable. But your reporting is it could be even less than that.
That's right, Nora. That report was from 2013, and it actually found the number was even lower, 9. Taking out just 9 critical substations could black out the whole country. We were told by multiple sources that the number has not changed much, that less than 20 is a fair assessment.
Although it is important to keep in mind that the consequences on our lives doesn't even depend on who launches the attack. I personally suspect that it will be used in the same manner that 9/11 was to push through the Patriot Act. So, did you know that the Patriot Act was actually written years before 9/11 even happened? But they knew it would be impossible to pass, so it sat on a shelf somewhere until the terror attack happened. And then coincidentally, hey, they already had it written. They went and got it off the shelf, dusted it off, and bam, the US has never been the same. So if a cyber attack does happen, expect legislation to miraculously appear, already written, ready to be signed. And within that will be extreme intrusions into your individual liberties. I mean, could we expect anything different? Of course not. And that's because they'll say we need more surveillance powers to ensure this never happens again. But yeah, the point is that a cyber attack helps their agenda on multiple fronts. Economic collapse, resetting the world economy to a carbon-based system, surveillance and other authoritarian measures against their own citizens. They could even use it to drum up support for world war. Now, if they blame domestic groups, well, that could help them wipe out political opposition. The possibilities are endless with this one. They can use it in so many different ways. Every crisis is an opportunity, right? I mean, it could even delay or stop the election from happening in 2024. The thing is that people have to understand there are trillions and trillions of dollars at stake with this Davos plan. And so it's stuff like this that makes me think something crazy is going to impede the 2024 election.
The State of the Union's coming up, and the president's got to, and I think will because he believes this. We got to move this. Because that's the only way we keep 1.5 degrees alive. So how do we get there? Well, the lesson I've learned in the last years, and I learned it as secretary and I've learned it since, reinforced in spades, is money, 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 money.
It's just that a lot of people don't fully understand that trillions and trillions of dollars are at stake. And the United States moving towards a populist position, well, that threatens everything. Multinational corporations, elected and unelected bureaucrats, and various governments from around the world are seeing dollar signs everywhere and above everything else. The rest of it is just virtue signaling. But you have to ask yourself, what would they do to protect their investments? So would they use a cyber attack to protect their vision for the world? Yeah, probably. Yeah, they would. They have a big plan, and they will risk everything to achieve it. As Klaus Schwab says, people assume that we're going back to the good old world, and everything will be normal again. That is, let's say fiction, it will not happen. End of quote.
So people assume we are just going back to the good old world which we had, and everything will be normal again in how we are used to normal, in the old fashion. This is, let's say, fiction. It will not happen.
I personally believe that they know destruction is the only path to this quote-unquote new world. Now, we didn't get a chance to talk about these yet, but there's been a few globalist events that took place recently, and I'm pretty sure Bloomberg hosted them. And so the titles of these events are as follows: Chaos to Clarity, Embracing Instability, and a New Path for the World. Now it could just be me, but I think that illuminates our future path, and it's not good. So perhaps it's time to consider something more is happening. But hey, it could always be the simple answer. It could be that these politicians are simply morally bankrupt, soulless, greedy, petty, and imbecilic enough to threaten the entire US system in order to protect their claim to power. However, let's consider for a second that there is something more nefarious happening. As stated, the United States and our individual liberties are a major roadblock to this agenda, and our brewing civil conflict sets us on the road to a new political paradigm. And yes, it is true, that new paradigm is built upon a foundation of collectivism, and a base understanding that you don't have a voice in the political process, that you don't have a right to dictate your own path, that you don't have a right to dictate how you live your life. Yes, this new system is all based upon compliance, with social credit scores and digital ID modifying your behavior. If you step out of line, if you break from the current political orthodoxy, then you forfeit your freedom, then you forfeit your basic human rights, locked out of society, ostracized, and persecuted. It's all very simply anti-humanism. And it all starts to make a little more sense when you consider the psychological aspect. The tyrants have attached themselves to the climate cultists to ensure that they have some kind of public support for their tyranny. And of course, the destruction of the human race. I mean, if that is your goal, why not align yourselves with the self-proclaimed extinctionists, am I right? Yes, they hide behind notions of saving the environment, when in reality, they just want less people. Speaking of which, did you see this? Even breathing is bad for the environment. And I quote, "As I and others have predicted years ago at this point, the war on climate change was always going to come down to restricting basic, essential human biological activity, because it's a war on life itself. They say in the study, and I quote, we would urge caution in the assumption that emissions from humans are negligible." Yes, that's right, the science fatwa against breathing presumably extends to non-human animal life as well. I mean, yeah, that makes total sense. We all know the quote from Confucius, "In order to protect life on Earth, we must kill life on Earth." And I'm kidding, that quote does not exist because this is insane. Anyway, we are getting it from all sides too. The people developing artificial intelligence and transhumanism are also rather evidently anti-human in principle.
Maybe most legal systems are based on this idea, this belief in human rights. But human rights are just like heaven and like God. It's just a fictional story that we've invented and spread around. It may be a very nice story, it may be a very attractive story, we want to believe it, but it's just a story. It's not a reality.
Human rights are just like heaven and like God, a fictional story that we have invented. End of quote. Yes, if we invented the notion of human rights, then human rights do not exist. Therefore, they can strip you of your human rights. Yeah, that's exactly what they're working towards. Everybody has to realize the people dictating your future have the most soulless outlook on life, and this inherent anti-human sentiment rests at the core of their agenda. It's woven into the very fabric of their policy proposals. You have to be determined to push back against it, because the root of this issue is widespread and deeply psychological. I believe their hate for the human species is compounded by their jaded and nihilistic worldview. However, it originates from their individual psychological profile. Now, just so happens, these very, very important industries are plagued by people with similar self-destructive tendencies. And on top of that, their personal insecurities often find their way into their programming and decision-making process. And so is it a stretch to consider that this deep-seated hate for themselves might have finally transcended their inner monologue and is actively wreaking havoc on the world. I personally don't think so. All I can say is that you should disavow the extinctionists and embrace being a humanist. And so to finish up, I have 2 quotes for you to consider as we head into 2024, and I quote, "I speak not to nations, only to the individual few, for whom it goes without saying that cultural values do not drop down like manna from heaven, but are created by the hands of individuals. If things go wrong in the world, this is because something is wrong with the individual, because something is wrong with me. Therefore, if I am sensible, I shall put myself right first. For this I need, because outside authority no longer means anything to me, a knowledge of the innermost foundations of my being, in order that I may base myself firmly on the eternal facts of the human psyche." And so yes, for this year, 2024, my only advice is to focus and build yourself up, for all we can do is try to be a little bit better than we were. It's an ongoing process, don't forget it. Stay true to yourself, stand on principle, and we'll see our way through the storm. But I will leave you with this: I hope for nothing, I fear nothing, I am free. Once again, this is HelioWave. If you like the content, like, comment, and subscribe. Share the video if you want to. If you're in a position to, consider subscribing on Locals or Subscribestar. As always, make sure you disobey those true fascistas, and yes, I do hope you have a good night.